Pray. Father, thank you for being so good to us that we can't even begin to imagine the extent of your grace and your love. We can say it, but Father, our hearts couldn't contain it all even if we could conceive it. Lord, today, show us your love in ways that we never thought possible. That through this, we would love you more. We would love one another more selflessly than we ever have. That we would have an understanding in this fallen world how to follow you. And that truly with all our hearts. Thank you, Lord. Fill us with your Spirit, that your Spirit might move in our hearts and in this place, and that we might be more like Jesus when you're done with us. Oh, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. As I think most of you know, I do a little presentation called the Biblical Dinner. Calling it little is probably an exaggeration because it really is quite a long, big thing. But in the biblical dinner, those of you, how many of you have not been to one of my biblical dinners? Just a few of you. Well, for the benefit of those of you who haven't been, and for the benefit of reminding those of you who have, you'll probably remember that one of the most significant things that we talk about in this recreation of John chapter 13, which is the biblical dinner, is when Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And the reason why that's so significant is how these people, his disciples, and the readers of the original gospel, the hearers of it, who were listening to it being read to them, and the account, the people who heard the apostles tell the story to them, how they would have, in their minds, not imagined, but known what foot washing really was. So I remind you that, which you probably know quite well, that washing feet, I have a mustache here that's trying to grow up my nose. I don't know if that's rude or not, but that's kind of what's happening here. So it happens on Sunday mornings at my church too. I'll start doing this and the people will thinking, what's he doing? It's one of those strange things of having a mustache. Ladies, you're blessed. Jesus, when he washed the disciples' feet, did something that astonished the disciples. As many of you remember, and some of you may not know, the person who was supposed to wash everyone's feet at the Last Supper was not Jesus. It was actually supposed to have been Peter because of where he sat at the Last Supper table, which, in case you don't know, didn't look anything like Da Vinci's table. Nothing like it whatsoever. Peter was in the last position at the table, the lowest position at the table. And if there were no foot-washing servants or slaves present to wash people's feet at a great feast, which this was, then the assignment to wash people's feet went to that person in that particular position. As we found, it was Peter. But what we need to understand about the Last Supper is this, about the foot washing at the Last Supper. In every household that had servants or slaves, you had ranks of servants. In other words, it was as if they were wearing military stripes of some sort, ranks. And the highest ranking servant in any household that had servants or slaves was the chief steward of the house. That person was almost considered more of a friend rather than a slave to the master of many houses because he did such a good job. If you ever saw the movie Ben-Hur, the original, not the one that came out last year, but the one with Charlton Heston and all of that, Charlton Heston's character, Ben-Hur, if you've seen the movie, has a servant that wears a kippah, and he has a big beard, like our friend here. And his name is Simonides. And Simonides does really good things for Judah Ben-Hur. And Judah Ben-Hur praises him. And he says, "Oh, Simonides, because of you this year, I am a wealthier and better man." And Simonides says, "I am here to serve the house of Hur." And he's held in great esteem. This is very true. It's a very real scenario. Despite the fact that it's Hollywood, it's a good scenario. Because the chief servant of the household was very respected, but he was a slave. He owned nothing. He was owned by his master. He had no personal rights whatsoever. The only thing he lived for was to serve the house that he served. That was it. Now we have an example of that, actually a few, but one really good one in the Bible that really stands out, and that's Joseph. Not Joseph as in Joseph and Mary, but Joseph the son of Jacob. Remember, his brothers get jealous of him. They sell him to some Arabs passing by, heading down towards Egypt. The Arabs sell him as a slave to Potiphar's house, who was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh. And he goes into this household as a lowest level slave, and in 2 years, he's running the house. And everybody respects him. They all like him. And he's very, very honorable. But he's still a slave. He's still owned by the household. That's the highest ranking slave in a household, the chief steward of the house. And people usually liked this person, and they admired this person, they would respect this person, but he was still a slave. The lowest ranking person, as you go down, you would first of all pass people like you would have, if you were a wealthy person, you would buy your health care system by buying a doctor. And he would be a high-ranking servant. And then you might have educators to educate your children. Remember, education was rare back then, so educators were very valuable people, and you might buy teachers, and they would be high-ranking. And then you get down into cooks and washerwomen and body servants. But in every household, the lowest-ranking servant, slave, was only one person. Guess who? The foot washer. There was nobody in the rank of slaves, and this is the way you would have thought in those days. There are different ranks of slaves. Not all slaves were equal. The lowest slave was the foot washing servant, because the foot washing servant did the worst job in the world. They washed the bottom of people's feet, which in that part of the world was the filthiest part of the human body. You might think I could think of worse places than that, but you don't need to, because that was bad. They know where you have been walking, your feet smell, you've been walking where animals have been. If you're walking through a city or a village, you're walking through open sewage, because they didn't have good drainage in these places. You say, it's disgusting. Yes, it is, and that's why the foot washing slave who had to wash people's feet was considered the lowest form of life on earth. They were very low. Over in Mark chapter 9, Jesus, when he's talking to his disciples, after they had gotten into another altercation about who was the greatest in the kingdom, they're constantly, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. No, you're not, I am. Jesus once again intervenes in one of their many arguments about who's the greatest. And he says, do you want to know who the greatest in my Father's kingdom is? The greatest in my Father's kingdom is the servant of all. You've heard that, right? We have songs about that. The greatest in my Father's kingdom literally is the slave of everyone. When they heard that, they didn't conceptualize it the way that we do. When we say, we need to learn to be the servant of all, what does that mean? Now, you know, a peasant doesn't think like that. A peasant doesn't analyze like that. They don't abstract well, especially a Hebrew. So Jesus is teaching his disciples the way they understand, and he's using something they thoroughly understand. When Jesus says the slave of everyone, as pastors in the West, and if you teach a Bible study or just studying your Bible or doing a devotion, you might just think, what does that mean? Now let me see. Let me think, what does it mean to be the servant of everyone? There's my neighbor, and there's the people down the street, the people at the church, the people at my work, the people in my home. But when the disciples heard Jesus say this, they only heard one thing. The slave of everyone, to them, was the lowest ranking slave in a household, which means that when Jesus said the slave of everyone, they heard foot washer, and they did not like it. And obviously they tried to ignore it, and so did Peter. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, after all the communion elements were celebrated, consumed, and all of the communion elements, Passover elements, it became communion for us, Jesus gets up from the table and he begins to wash people's feet because Peter refused to do it. Peter obviously believed that he shouldn't be sitting in this humiliating seat where he was sitting. If you don't know what I'm talking about, well, I can show you this later because I don't want to do a biblical dinner for you this morning. You don't need that. I just need to remind you of some things because this is important. But Jesus got up from the table. Now, he's sitting in the host position, and the host is like a king almost at a table. He doesn't do anything humiliating. But the person who washes someone's feet does something that is incredibly humiliating. In fact, if you wash someone's feet in those days, it was considered shameful. It wasn't an act where you say, well, it's a humiliating act, but I'll do it. It was shameful. And I'm going to say this a lot this morning, and you'll see why. That the worst thing in the world for these people was not death, it was shame. It's that way in the Middle East today. Why are they fighting? Why is everybody mad at everybody else over there? Shame. Sometime about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, some family humiliated another family, and the other family said, we will take it out on you in blood because you shamed a family member. Some of you come from cultural backgrounds where you thoroughly understand this. If you think about in America, because maybe you've read books or seen movies or something, about the American Italian mafia, there's all kinds of different sorts of ethnic background organized crime, so I'm just picking on the one. The Italian mafia in America, if you hurt one of my family members, I'm going to kill some of yours. Very violent. But it has to do with not just pain, but shame. It's very, very embedded here in Europe, but especially in the Middle East. To wash someone's feet was shameful because you're scrubbing the filth off of the filthiest part of the human body. And if you had to do that, it was like, I can't hide my face, but I wish I could bury it in the sand because I don't want anybody to know that it's me doing this because it's disgusting and it's shameful. Jesus, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Messiah, the Savior of Israel, the Savior of the world, gets up from the table and begins to wash his disciples' feet, including Peter's feet. And Peter was the one who was supposed to wash everyone's feet. And that means that Jesus, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Messiah, Savior of Israel, Savior of the world, God in human flesh, wash the feet of a foot washer. Well, when John said through this Jesus showed the full extent of his love, that was it. The Lord of the universe not only humiliated himself, shamed himself by washing people's feet, he washed a foot washer's feet, and that was even worse than shame. It was something that they had never thought of. It's something that we have never thought of. But it's something that Jesus showed them, and when they saw it, they were horrified. Now, if you've been following this whole series that we've been talking about, A Peasant's Bible, you know how Jesus has been teaching his disciples. They're not Greeks, they're not Hellenized, they're kosher Hebrews from a part of the world that still thinks in an old world Eastern style of thinking, something called an ancient dialectical logic, where you don't say, let me give you a concept, and then let me give you more information on the concept, and then I'll illustrate it. You have to start with the illustration and then attach the meaning to it. In other words, you wouldn't say, as most pastors do, I read a scripture. Now I give you the theology. Now let me illustrate. Now let me bring it home and challenge you. That's a typical sermon. For Jesus, he would say, you know what we covered this yesterday, didn't we? You know what a rock is? Yeah. Okay, Peter, you're like that. Oh, okay, I get it. I'm like a building block, right? Oh, yes, that's it. See? So he would start with the object and then attach a meaning to it, and then they would understand the concept. Now, that sounds very elementary. As a matter of fact, it sounds like what you do in Sunday school, right? You do it for a reason. Because it is a very childlike, not childish, but a childlike way of learning. But it's also very, very effective. And it really only works with Middle Eastern people who don't abstract well. Because this is their thinking. They're not stupid and they're not unwise. It's just a different way of thinking. If you're from there or you know people that are, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And a message goes out from that, which he didn't specify that night, but showed the world the next day. This is what I'm talking about. In other words, now that I've described it to you, you know what foot washing is like? You would say, oh, yeah, I know now. All right. What I'm about to do for the world, past, present, and future, tomorrow, on the cross, is just like that. I'm going to wash the feet of the world. The cross was not a type. Washing feet was. The cross wasn't an example. Washing feet was. He washes people's feet, and then he washes the feet of a foot washer. Nobody washes a foot washer's feet. That means he went below the lowest person in the world in order to lift them up, in order to cleanse them, because the lowest person in the world was a foot washer. Nobody washed a foot washer's feet. What did Jesus just do? He went beneath a foot washer and washed his feet. The next day he goes to the cross, and there he washes your feet. As a matter of fact, he washed the feet of the entire world so that whoever will could be saved. If you want to come, you can. But I've done terrible things. You can come. But I've been genocidal. You can come. But I've been a filthy, vile psychopath. If you want Jesus and you want salvation and you want forgiveness, you could come. Now that's hard for us to take because people need to be punished for their sins. But Jesus forgives sins to the repentant. Or you wouldn't be sitting here today. Neither would I be standing here. With that in mind, I want to take you on a little journey. The cross. Jesus died on the cross for the sin of the world, for the sins of the world. What is that like? Now, I'm not going to get real gross here because, you've probably heard this is how Jesus died on the cross, and then it makes you cry and all of that. And I find that often manipulation, just to get people sad and say, oh, poor Jesus, look what he did for me, and you weep and all of that. That's okay, but that's not what we're doing here. But some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are definitely, shall we say, a little more adult in nature. The cross. We wear them. Nothing wrong with that. But when you go looking at crosses, you find them mostly stylized. In fact, I think one of the most beautiful things in the world, to me, is when you just see a high cross. It doesn't matter the denomination it came out of, but just the stylization of a high cross to me is breathtaking. They don't have them in America. And you see that and you go, it makes me think of Jesus. And it's really neat. And then people wear crosses around their neck. I had a friend years ago, he passed on years ago. And he used to wear, he was a Protestant, but he wore a cross that was brass, that was this big and that wide. It was kind of thin, but it was huge. And he hung this around his neck. Every time you saw him, he had this big cross on. And one day, I was standing there when somebody asked him, Dr. Martin, why do you wear that big cross? And he said, because if the devil hates it, I'm going to wear it. So I'm not saying don't wear crosses or have them for earrings or whatever. I just want you to understand something that the disciples understood about the cross, that peasants understood about a cross, especially Middle Eastern peasants, the people of the Bible. We have stylized crosses. Somebody even wrote, and I found this ad. It was an ad in, I think it was some Christian magazine. And it had a picture kind of like this, except it was a little flashier because it was an ad for people to buy crosses. And it said, "The Inspired Cross Collection, a beautiful line of contemporary designs for women and men in pendants, rings, earrings, tie tacks, and a choice of precious metals with or without diamonds." Okay, the cross. The people of Jesus' day, as you can guess, would never have even thought that, much less produced something like that, because the cross wasn't anything like that to them. We have crosses on steeples, crosses on churches, crosses in parks, crosses on hills, and they're all a symbol of what Jesus did. If people aren't Christians, they find it a symbol of Christianity at the very least. But somehow it all adds up to the cross. Christianity, Jesus, salvation, holiness, uprightness, it's the cross. And there's a reverence about it, even if it's just a stylized cross like this, that we find it, and I find even atheists find it rather disgusting when a person wearing a cross does a disgusting thing, a sinful or unholy thing, and yet they're wearing a cross, because people still attach great meaning to it. The meaning of a holy person, the meaning of a person whose intention really is truly to do good. And if they do wrong, they are sorry for the wrong that they did, rather than someone who doesn't care what people think, but they wear the cross anyway because grandma gave it to them, or because maybe God will approve of them no matter what they do. But the cross isn't like that, as you know. This is the Grunwald altarpiece that some of you may have seen in person. This is quite possibly the most realistic medieval depiction of the crucifixion anybody ever painted. Now, there are lots of depictions of crucifixion, and most of them are medieval, but most of them are really, really nice and clean. You have a nice, clean cross with a few little blood streaks on it, and it's very artistically done. Grunwald comes along and he paints this. This is probably quite close to what the real crucifixion was like for Jesus. Now, I'm going to give you more details about something else that will bring it home. I don't know about that guy on the right whose hand is kind of twisted, so strange, pointing at him. But Jesus is bleeding, he's beaten up, he's cut all over his body, he's assumed a very unnatural position. You could see his hands not like this, but like that, in pain. And this was painted about 500 years ago. It's really about the only one you're going to find that seems to really bring home what Jesus went through. Then we come up to today. Jim Caviezel playing Jesus in the movie The Passion of the Christ. And here he is carrying this big cross in the movie endlessly towards Calvary. It took a good portion of the movie for him to drag the cross there, when in fact it wasn't that far away from where he was being condemned. He's very bloodied, he's very beaten. Again, this picture is kind of grainy for good reasons, because they did an outstanding job on the makeup on this man. And actually, the one thing that Mel Gibson, who directed the movie, probably got right in the movie was the beating that Jesus took when he was flogged and how he looked afterwards. This is probably very accurate. We can only guess, but because of the descriptions in the Bible and matching them up with ancient history, it was really, really savage and bloody. But I got to tell you something about that cross that he's on. It didn't look like that. The disciples, the people of that age, might have depicted a cross like that just to say the cross or crucifixion. But the real cross probably didn't look anything like that. Back in 1968, a discovery was made. The discovery was a box like this box, in fact, which is called an ossuary. It was a way for a person to be buried when they died in the times of Jesus. It was invented by the Romans, and the Judeans had picked up on the custom and actually carried it through until at the time when the temple was destroyed, and finally in 135 AD, 50 years later, Hadrian comes in, and then they kind of stopped doing this tradition. What is the deal with this? Well, this box is not huge like that. It's only about this big. It's made out of limestone, carved, if you were rich, or clay, and it was molded and then just low fired. But it's a box, and it has a lid on top of it. Now, when a person died in those days, there were tombs all over Israel, especially around Jerusalem. Now, I said this box is a Roman custom. It is a Roman custom. But here's how the Jews incorporated this custom into what they did, very similar to the Romans. When you go to Israel, you will find tombs all over the place, and they're like caves. You usually have to duck really low to get in. They're not very high. And then when you go inside, there might be chambers. If it's a rich man's tomb, it could be as big as this room, but it's cave. It's carved out of rock. And then you would have niches that went off into the side that broke off into other little chambers that are only like tubes. They're not very big. You can barely get a body in there, much less a second person to help move the body in there. Is this kind of disgusting or troubling to you? I don't want it to be. I want to be as objective as we can about this. So when a person died, what they would do, and you can see this with what happened to Jesus, but also Lazarus, is they would take the body and they would wash it, and then they would wrap it up like a mummy and impregnate the wrappings with spices, oils, and what have you, in order to keep the odor down, very simply. And then they would take the body on a stretcher and take it to a tomb that the family owned. And they would bring it into the tomb, and they would put it in one of these niches, which is usually a tunnel that goes off to the side somehow. It goes back in. Sometimes it would lay parallel with the wall, and it would be cut into the wall. But that was Roman more, because that was the way the catacombs were built. You know, the catacombs weren't sewers. They were underground cemeteries. In case you thought they were sewers, they're not sewers. But they would put the body in these chambers, and they would do it the same day the person died. That was the rule. The day they died, they went into the tomb. They didn't keep them in a funeral home or something like that. They didn't embalm the body. They would treat it when they would put it in. And then they would wait. They'd seal up the tomb, and they would wait about a year. About a year later, the body has now decomposed, so that really all you have left are bones and what's left of the wrappings, because they've all pretty much also decomposed with the body. Then the family goes back to the tomb, and they handle the bones. Now, this makes them ceremonially unclean, so they have to plan this correctly, because they don't want to be ceremonially unclean around the time of a great feast, or they can't participate in the feast. So they plan it, they go to the tomb, and they gather the bones of the person that died, and then they put them in this box, a bone box, an ossuary. Again, it's just the size of the largest bone in the human body. It can hold a femur. This is your leg bone right here. That's the longest bone in the body. So it would be about as long as the longest bone in your body. And then you could put the pelvis in there and the skull in there and all the other bones. Sometimes the bone boxes were large enough for a portion of a family. I don't know why they did it that way, but they did. Now, this bone box was found in 1968 in a tomb just outside of Jerusalem. On the outside, it simply says Yohanan ben Hagkal. Yohanan is John. Okay, so if you were to say John in Hebrew, it's Yohanan. And ben Hagkal, the son of Hagkal. And I don't know what that means, but son of Hagkal. And that's what it says right there. When they found this particular bone box, it had an unusual contents to it. First of all, it still had bones in it. When they dig up bone boxes in Israel, very often the bones have gone to dust. There's just nothing left. So you open it up and it's dusty in there, but there's really nothing to look at. There's nothing to collect. There's no forensic evidence if you wanted to see if you could find out who this person was, except for the name on the box. And that name, he's a nobody. However, when they opened this box up, they found 3 sets of bones. They found a little girl who had apparently died of some disease or something, the bones of her. They found a teenage girl who had apparently died of some disease or something. And then they found the bones of a grown man, a man who was about 5'6", which is actually about average height, maybe even a little taller for those days. When they found the body of the man, of course, they sort the bones out. These forensic archaeologists, they say they have this find. Okay, we have some bones. Let's see if they have a story to tell. And they lay it all out on the tables in the laboratory, and they start measuring the bones, and here's the little girl, and here's the teenage girl, and here's the man. And as they lay out the bones of the man, they begin to find some very interesting things about this man. In fact, they're so interesting that to this day, nobody has ever found a set of bones in Israel anything like this man. They discovered that forensically, he was the only hard evidence of a truly crucified individual ever found. And the reason they know that is because when they started sorting everything out, they found his calcified heel bone, which was removed from the rest of his body, apparently by a sword. Somebody had cut his foot off. Forgive me, I know this is kind of, okay, right, but just go with it for a second, okay? Please bear with me. I'm not going to try and make you grossed out or anything, but... And through his heel bone, they found a nail. That's the nail. That's his heel bone. And when they saw that, they suddenly realized this man had been crucified. We need to look at his skeleton very, very closely. Now, had they found other crucified people that they could say were for sure crucified? No. But they had found other people that they suspected may have been crucified. But they couldn't tell. You say, why would they suspect it? Well, here's why. This is positive proof that this man was nailed to a cross. There was a nail through the heel bone. Apparently, when they nailed his foot to the cross through his heel bone, that the nail on the left side apparently hit a rock embedded in a tree. You know that happens. You know, the tree grows and it gathers up rocks or things, or a very, very hard knot. And the nail, when it hit it on the inside of the tree, bent back. So they couldn't get the nail out of his foot. So they had to, forgive me, they probably used a sword, and they separated his foot from his leg, and then they had to hack the nail out of the tree. Because they also found evidence on the left side of calcification of wood, almost like petrified wood. And it was an olive tree. It's olive wood. So they apparently took his body and his foot, they wrapped it up, they put him in a tomb, and then they dried him out for a year. They collected his bones, they put him in that ossuary, and then they reburied the ossuary in another tomb that has little bitty niches, and it sat there for 2,000 years until these archaeologists, or actually it wasn't an archaeologist, it was somebody digging a trench for laying pipe, and they cut into the tomb. And of course, when they find that, they immediately call the archaeologist to come and say, what did we just do? And they found it in there. Now, here's the thing. I had mentioned that they didn't know if other bones that had been found were crucified people or not. One of the reasons why it's very questionable is that people who were crucified back in those days, when they were taken down from a crucifixion cross, were either burned, like the pagans would do it, or thrown into a garbage dump. You say, that's terrible. I know. And here's why. Crucifixion wasn't just painful, wasn't just horrible, but far worse. Crucifixion was shameful. So you wouldn't bury most crucifixion victims. As a matter of fact, if they weren't just left to rot on the cross, which often happened, you say, well, Jesus was on the cross, they took him down by the end of the day. Most crucifixion victims would be left up there until literally their body just rotted off the cross. This is disgusting, I know, but that's the way it happened. And then again, they would take the pieces into a garbage dump or burn them in a garbage pile, like down in the Hinnom Valley where they kept something burning all the time. The forensic evidence of other people's bones suggests that they may have been crucified, but there were no nails and no nail marks. But the bones were twisted and bent. Now, people could have had rickets back in those days, bone diseases that causes your bones to bend because of nutrition or injuries or what have you. And they have found skeletons where the bones are bent. But here's the thing about crucifixion. You didn't always nail a person to a cross. In fact, that was the exception, not the rule. Typically, to crucify someone, the Romans tied you to a cross. And they would tie you in the most uncomfortable position that their malicious sense of humor would allow them to do that particular day. They just wanted to see you suffer. When they put you on a cross, they could tie you into all kinds of crazy shapes. And as you hung there on the cross, your bones would be stressed and they could bend, and then you would die, and they'd take those bones. And they found a lot of bones that were deformed. But they don't know if it was because the person was deformed or because they were crucified. But when they found this, they knew they had a crucifixion victim. So they laid him out and they began to examine him very, very carefully. And here's what they found. They found the nail. This is the way it looks on the right, and you can actually see this. Let me take the microphone here and get a little closer. But you can actually see this in the Israel Museum. There's one particular room in the Israel Museum that I really recommend you go visit if you ever go to Israel. It's a room where it has first century antiquities. Remember I showed you the bone box, the ossuary? The microphone's just a little loud. I don't know if we can fix that or not. But the ossuary that with Ben Hagkal, they don't have his ossuary in there. They have Caiaphas's ossuary in there. They have King Herod the Great's ossuary in there, his actual sarcophagus. They have a stone that actually has Pontius Pilate's name carved in it as a dedication plaque, proving that Pontius Pilate was an historical person. Skeptics said, no, he's not a real person. But then they find the stone, and it's got his name on it. And all of these things are all in one particular room, and they have this heel bone in a glass case standing up there, well lit, so you can see it, and part of the story is related below. Well, this is what they think it looked like when they nailed Ben Hagkal to the cross. Nobody knows what he did. Again, he was about 5'6". He was young. He was born with a cleft palate. He was, as far as they can tell by his bone structure, quite a healthy man when they crucified him. So whatever he did, it must have been considered really bad by the Romans because they only put nails in the really bad boys. And he was nailed to a cross. The piece of wood on the left that you see, that worked as a gasket. So when they put the nail through his heel, it meant that it was there to keep his foot from popping off the nail. You'd say, boy, that would really hurt. I can't even imagine how much something like that might hurt. But it was also possible if you were determined enough to get your foot off the cross if you didn't have that piece of wood. So the wood was merely there to hold it on. That would also go, we need to do something about this. Sorry, is there anything that we can, too loud? Good? Okay, great. So, all right, we'll get Pedro when he gets back. There we go. Okay, so They would do it on your hands too. As they examined Ben Hogkal's body, they didn't find anything unusual about his skull except for the cleft palate, and that was a birth defect. They found that his head was slightly misshapen too. They said probably from the birth process something happened and he didn't quite have a symmetrical head. Big deal. That's normal. You know, people are born that way today and regular people. That's us, okay? But they did find something very interesting. Now, I don't know anatomy well, so I can't even tell you the names of the bones, and some of you are going to go, I know, just go with me. These two bones in your arm right here. When they were looking for evidence of crucifixion, and you go with a medieval painting or a statue in a church, where would you look for the nail prints? Right here. Now, you may have been told in recent years, because of recent historical discoveries, that they would put the nail here instead, which means here would be painful enough, but it could tear the tissue and the person could escape or fall off. You put it here and they're very securely bound to the cross. This goes through the carpal nerve. Now, if you've ever had carpal tunnel syndrome, you know how painful that is. Stick a steel object on that nerve, which is electrical, and watch what happens. But with Ben Hogkal, they didn't put it there either. When they examined these two bones here, they found a notch on this bone, on the inside of the bone here. And then a series of notches all the way down until the two bones met here. What they think happened is they nailed him through the forearm, and as he is on the cross, in order to breathe, you have to pull yourself up and down, because when you're hanging, the musculature in your chest doesn't allow you to exhale. You can inhale, but you can't exhale. To exhale, you've got to go like that. So you can imagine the agony that's put on a person on the cross. Do I need to get air sickness bags for anybody here? Please forgive me. Okay, I'm not going to get much more graphic than this. But the nail worked its way up here. Here you don't have the carpal nerve, you have the radial nerve. And that's even worse than the carpal nerve, and so it's extremely painful, and finally the nail ended up here. And this is where he ended up hanging like that. Now here's the other part of what happened with him here. To step away just for a second. When he's on the cross, it's not like Jesus. As he's on the cross, his arm is extended, this much we know, but the Romans were apparently in quite a playful mood that morning. I set this down here and hopefully we can get a little sound. What they had done with him on this cross was they had bent it. First, when you put a person on a cross, let me explain to you how you do this. The cross is not very high. It's not way up there. I'll explain this in a minute because you might think, well, it had to be. Crosses were always at eye level. And they weren't necessarily something you carried all the time. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. And no one ever carried a full cross. No one. It was too heavy. We built one at our church to Roman specifications. It weighs between 500 and 600 pounds. You're not going to move it. Even Jim Caviezel, there in the movie The Passion of the Christ, he had to have that cross made out of a lightweight wood, and it was hollow because it weighed 135 pounds, lightweight wood and hollow. Jesus never carried a cross that looked like that. Neither did Ben Hogkal. So, when they attach him to the cross, here's the procedure that they would have done. They would have taken the condemned man, like Ben Hogkal, and they would have given him the cross piece. What did the cross piece look like? Well, we all know it was a square board. Not necessarily. The Romans were not artists. They were brutes. The Greeks were artists. The Persians were a bit more artistic, and it appears that crucifixion began with the Persians. But the Greeks, of course, they wanted everything symmetrical, and when they adopted crucifixion, probably after Alexander the Great may have brought it back from Persia after conquering Persia, that they had these nice, neat crosses. And usually they were T-shaped, by the way, where you had a post and a notch at the top, and then you had the cross piece, which had a hole in it. You'd put the pieces together like tongue and groove, and you'd make sure you tied it on nice and tight. The Romans weren't so particular. So Ben Hogcall's crosspiece, how about Jesus' crosspiece? May have just been a branch, just a thick branch of olive wood. Olive wood is very heavy. Olive wood is very sturdy. You don't carve it well because it chips a lot, even though there's a lot of olive wood carvings. It just kind of, it's a brittle wood, but it's very, very heavy, laden with oil. And Ben Hogcall probably was handed his crosspiece, and then he carried it to the crucifixion site. When people carried their crosses to the crucifixion sites that they were going to, they were surrounded by Roman soldiers. How many? 4. Just 4. When Jesus was crucified, along with the 2 other guys with him, there were probably only a dozen soldiers, maybe a few more because of the controversy, thank you, that might have surrounded Jesus and the mobs and all of that. But usually a crucifixion only involved 4 Roman soldiers. So the victim is beaten, abused, whatever they did to him. In Jesus' case, you know the story, but with Ben Hogcall's case, we really don't know what they might have done to him. If anything, you don't have to beat somebody up before you put them on the cross. In fact, you really don't want to, because you want them to last longer on the cross, because it's a terrible torture. So the less they're beaten, the longer they last. The longer they last, the greater the torture. That's the Roman mentality. So Ben Hogcall is given his crosspiece. He can't carry the whole cross. There's a Roman soldier in front of him who is carrying on a pole a sign. The sign says what he did bad. You want everybody to know. So the sign has his crime on it. The Roman soldier goes down the street towards the crucifixion site from the seat of judgment, holding the sign. The victim is behind him, probably with another soldier in front of him, but he's behind the guy with the sign because everybody knows here comes a condemned man and here's what he did. And as they go through the street, there would be 2 more soldiers behind, maybe to push crowds away or just to make sure that the guy doesn't try to make an escape, which, if I were in his shoes, I would definitely try to make an escape. I'd rather get killed with a sword than hang on a cross. 4 soldiers. They come to the crucifixion site. What do you find? You dig a hole, you put the cross in, you lift it up like you do in Hollywood, right? No. You have stationary posts that are in the ground. It could even be a tree stump. In fact, it could even be a tree. If you ever saw the movie The Nativity Story, it was a very good movie. I was surprised. There wasn't a lot of things in there that you could say, I don't think that's the right thing. I mean, they conjectured a lot. They added script. They invented some characters, a little story in the background. But none of it was heresy. None of it was even sacrilegious. And I appreciated that about a movie because Hollywood tends to really mess things up. It had quite a Catholic ending on it, but the rest of it was just sort of for everybody. It was very, very well done. And in the story, a very interesting thing happened in the movie. If you ever saw it, you would probably notice it, but pay attention to what's really going on. Mary is a Galilean. Galileans are rebels. They hate the Romans, and they do everything they can to make life bad for the Romans. And in the movie, Mary is walking through a grove of trees where there's a crossroad, and there's lots of people walking back and forth, and suddenly somebody starts yelling, "Romans! Romans!" And you see these men dragging branches across the road to impede the Romans who are coming, just to make it hard for them. And what did they do with Mary? Did she sit there and go, "No"? She grabs a branch and she pulls it across the road. And I thought, this is brilliant. Mary was an amazing person. She bore the Messiah because God said, "You are in my favor." That's so important. But she was also a Galilean. And I think they captured that when she grabs a small branch and pulls it across the road too. But later, a few minutes later, which depicts actually a few days in the movie, she's going back to those crossroads. And if you look carefully, you can see in the trees behind her in the crossroads, men like this. And they're crucified on those trees. See, you didn't need somebody to carry a post or the whole cross like you see in movies or like you see in paintings, because you couldn't. Romans would use whatever was available. And if they wanted to crucify somebody and it was inconvenient to do it any other way, they'd just take you up to a tree and nail you to that or tie you to it, and there you stayed. That was crucifixion. Well, typical crucifixion sites where it was done regularly, let's talk about Jerusalem. There were at least 2 crucifixion sites in Jerusalem, execution sites where crucifixions were done. And the way the crucifixions would happen, this is what the disciples saw, this is what the peasants saw, is that as they would come into Jerusalem, the crucifixion sites would be right next to the road. Romans never, can I say it again? They never crucified people on a hill far away. It was always right next to a road. You say, but they crucified Jesus on Golgotha. No, they didn't. The Bible says they crucified him at the place of the skull, not on it, because it was too far from the road. Whether you agree with the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built over the site of Golgotha and the tomb, or whether you agree with the site of Golgotha and the garden tomb, which is further to the north, it doesn't matter. It was not next to the road or on top of it. It was right next to the road, not on top of a hill, way far away. Why? Because the people have to be able to read the sign. They got to know why this guy is being crucified, because the Romans want you to know. If you can't read the sign, if you can read it all, if you can't read the sign, then that's not going to be a discouragement to people. Don't do that or you'll end up like him, or in some cases her. So it's always right along the side of a road. And typically at the execution sites, you would have a standing post. It would be in the ground. Again, it could be a tree stump with the branches hacked off of it, or it could be a post mounted in the ground. Now, if any of you have ever been a Jehovah's Witness or know Jehovah's Witnesses, they will insist that Jesus was crucified on a torture stake. And they will say, we get this from the Bible, from the Greek, that Jesus was crucified on a torture stake. What's a torture stake? Well, they really had these things in those days. A torture stake was the upright of the crucifixion cross. The Jehovah's Witnesses got it half right. I'm sorry, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, and I do not like their doctrine at all. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, please forgive me, come up and talk to me afterwards, don't slug me. But the torture stake, well, they would say Jesus was crucified like this on the stake. The stakes were permanent stakes in the ground. They did exist. They were there. But it said that Jesus was handed his cross and carried it. So we know that he wasn't crucified like this. He was crucified on the cross piece, because the cross that people carried was simply the cross piece. It wasn't the whole mechanism. It was just that part. Why? Because it weighed about 90 pounds. At least the one that we built did. So that's about all you can carry. You would carry it like this, you would carry it like that, but either way, that's how you carried it. But you didn't have the whole cross because it was too heavy. It was impossible. Now remember the Romans. They're brutes. They like things convenient. If they're going to crucify somebody, they're not going to go through a whole lot of work to do it. So they're not going to keep the uprights laying down on the ground. They're just going to take them to a place where somebody's already installed upright stakes, or there's a tree there, and they're just going to put them on that thing as fast as they can and back away, because they hate the Judeans, they hate the Jews, they don't even want to be in that part of the world. They're assigned there because they hate that part of the world because it's rough neighborhood. They just want it up there. So, 4 soldiers, one carrying the sign. Here comes Yohanan ben Hakal, and he's carrying his crosspiece. They get to the crucifixion site. The soldiers pick one of the posts, and there's usually a bunch of them, probably as many as 5 or 6, just in a permanent site. And they pick one of the posts. Now, before I tell you what it looked like and how it worked, let me tell you that there were incidents in that part of the world and all over the Roman Empire at different times during the Roman Empire, where they would crucify thousands of people. After Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, that the survivors that weren't sent into slavery, and there weren't many survivors compared to the 1.2 million who died in the siege of Jerusalem, but the 55,000 survivors were crucified on the roads leading in and out of Jerusalem, which means they used olive groves to do it. They would attach people to olive trees. Or they would have to insert stakes into the ground, which was going to be hard because it's such rocky soil, it would be hard to do. So they probably used existing trees all the way in and out of Jerusalem, and it had a lot of trees, mostly olive trees, and they crucified 55,000 people. You remember the revolt of Spartacus, which happened, of course, a long time before then, and the Romans actually had to set up crucifixion stakes all the way up and down the Via Appia Antica out of Rome in order to crucify 2,000 slaves along the whole way between Naples and there. But in the case of a city where a major city, where the Romans occupied the city, they would have one area that was used for crucifixion. So they bring Yohanan ben Haggkal to this place. There's stakes sticking up out of the ground. Every stake either has, at the top, as I mentioned, a little bump, and there's a notch that the crucifixion crosspiece goes on top of, or more likely with the Romans, it's just a tree sticking out of the ground or a tree stump with a notch cut in the top. The person is carrying a tree branch. That's the crosspiece. And when Yohanan ben Haggkal gets there, they throw him to the ground, and then one of the soldiers puts his foot on his neck. That pins him to the ground. Of course, where the head goes, the rest of the body goes. So he's going to be down there. He can't do anything about it. He's now stuck to the ground because the Roman has got his foot on his neck. The other 3 soldiers assemble the cross. 2 of them pick up the crosspiece, one on each end, and they hold it in the notch. The 3rd soldier gets behind the upright and ties it on. Down below the crosspiece, there's a permanent piece of wood, usually is a piece of wood, that's tied on to the cross. This is going to be a seat for the victim to sit on. You say, oh, well, at least they were merciful like that. It's not mercy. If you can sit, you can rest. If you rest, you last longer on the cross. The torture becomes more profound. Make sense? How tall was the cross? That tall. Here's how it worked. I have to step away from the mic here, so hopefully you can hear well. Yohanan ben Haggkal is then picked up off the ground by the soldiers after they've assembled the cross. They take him and they push him against this assembled cross. They tie his hands or his arms to the crosspiece. They don't want him to get away. So immediately they tie him there. They don't nail him yet. They just tie him there. Now he's flat on the ground. His feet are here. They pick up his feet off the ground. Now all his body goes on his arms. And as they pick up his feet off the ground, they were, for him, in a particularly playful mood that day. They didn't put his feet on top of each other and put the nail that way. They took his legs and put his knees together as they're bent and moved them off to one side, to the right, into this weird deformed position, and then took his feet and separated them, and then put one nail through each heel. And then they nailed him to the cross in this very awkward position. Painful. Agonizing. Have you ever heard the word excruciating? Excruciating. Out of the cross. That's where the word comes from. He's in this excruciating position. His feet are off the ground, but his head now is lower than your eye level. You say, no, he was way up there. Remember when Jesus was on the cross? He was thirsty, and finally at the very end he said, I'm thirsty. They put a sponge on a stick and they put it up to his mouth because they needed the stick to reach him. No, they didn't. If you think about it, a person on a cross wants one thing now that they're on the cross. They want to die fast because, man, they are in agony. if you're a Roman soldier or an enemy, and they want to drink, and you take a sponge and you dip it into either water, or in Jesus' case, sour vinegar, and you put it up to their mouth, they'd bite your fingers. They might have enough in there to do some real damage, and then you'll kill them. You'd think that they're going to provoke you to kill them any way they can. The Romans learned early on, don't put your hands near the mouth of a crucified victim. They'll do whatever damage they can. So how long is the pole? I got to tell you something. And remember, crucifixion is shameful. The pole is probably that long. The sponge is on the end. Why? In Roman cities, or Roman-occupied cities, where Rome was actually part of the building process or improvement process in the community, of which Jerusalem was also that way, the Romans would install public toilets. And the way the public toilets worked is, well, first of all, if you ever visit one, you just kind of go, you're kidding me, I would never do that. When you see it, they didn't have a men's room and a women's room, they just had one big room with benches or marble bars sticking out of the wall in which you could sit. Underneath, they always had flowing water to wash everything away. But there was a second channel in front of you by your feet when you sat down where there was fresh water flowing in a channel, a second channel. And now I'm going to get it's kind of graphic. I'm going to do it in good taste, but it's graphic. Please forgive me. That when you were done with your process, you would have brought with you, which would have been in a bucket over by the door, a stick with a sponge on the end of it. You would dip it into the pure water that was flowing in front of the trough underneath, and you would dip it there, and you would cleanse yourself with the stick and the sponge. And when you were done, you would hand it to a slave who would clean it and then put it back, and someone else would use it. You say, that is really sick. It's the best you could do back then, and it was considered very hygienic back then. Well, they put the vinegar up to Jesus' mouth with a sponge on a stick. Whether or not it was used for those purposes is only a matter of conjecture. But the message is clear. This is humiliating. This is shameful. Because if you were a peasant and they said they dipped a sponge on a stick in water and put it to Jesus' mouth, as a peasant you would almost vomit. I can't believe they did that. Now here's part of the rest of the process. I'm going to take you on a quick journey, and then we're going to take a break. And I'm going to tell you why we did this and talked about all these things. As I told you, crucifixion was shameful. If you were crucified like Yohanan ben Hakal, it's because you did something that the Romans thought was awful. Oh, I didn't finish the story. After they tied him up and he was attached to the cross, then they put the nails through. And then they may have removed the rope. They may not have removed the rope. Either way, he's attached to that thing. He's affixed to it. Okay, so they did put the nails in his arms, even when he was tied. That's how you started. You got to tie a guy. You just can't put nails in him. You got to tie him first, because otherwise he'll squirm. See, it sounds terrible, but that's what they did. And it was terrible. Any man on a cross is put there for the primary purpose of humiliation. I've already used the word shame. Get it very, very deep in your thoughts. The most terrible thing for people in the Middle East from thousands of years ago to even this day is not guilt, it's shame. That's why Jesus washes away our guilt and shame. To us, shame in the West is shame on you, but you'll get over it. In those days, nobody got over shame. Shame was like a permanent scar that deformed you somehow as a person if you were shamed. If you were shamed as a woman by being raped, you wouldn't ever show your face outside your house again because you were shamed. Never mind, it wasn't your fault. You were shamed. A person who was shamed, a foot-washing slave, didn't want to show their face anywhere. That was the most shameful job in the world. And a person who was on a cross died the most shameful death anyone could ever die. Because now that Yohanan ben Hagkal is attached to that cross in that very horrible position, he's a little below eye level of the passers-by. The sign that says what he did wrong is now affixed to the cross behind him, the post behind him, probably tied onto it or nailed onto it, it could be. So this becomes the upright of the cross. Normally a cross was shaped like a T. This becomes the part that goes up where it is stylized in our modern crosses. Or it could have been that the notch being below left a little nub up there. Either way, they still attach the sign so people coming by can see this is what this man did. As he's on the cross, he is not wearing one stitch of clothes. There isn't a little rag over him for privacy. They didn't do that to crucifixion victims. They wanted to shame the victims, and the biggest way to do it for the Jews was to put them up there naked. The Greeks, they didn't care so much. The Romans, maybe, maybe not. But the Jews, to be nude was a big shame. You just didn't do that. So they would make sure they did it. So Yohanan ben Hagkal is on the cross, and he's naked. Once the nails are in him, once all the weight is on his arms, the shock sets in, and he loses bladder control, and he loses bowel control. He begins to dehydrate, so if he's thirsty, they will give him something to drink because it will keep him alive longer, because that's what they want. And he hangs there. People can come by and mock him. People can come by and spit on him and do other disgusting things to him. The Romans don't care. As long as you don't try and take him down, you can abuse him all you want to. People come by, and they might even strike him. Dogs may come by and start to nibble on him. This was all part of the horrible process of crucifixion of Yohanan ben Hagkal and virtually any other crucifixion victim. This is the way they did it. Birds would come by and finish you off once you're dead. They would help themselves. But it was all meant to shame. Shame. And if you were a family member and you had a family member that was crucified, you couldn't show your face in public anymore because you were associated with someone who was shamed by crucifixion, and that brings shame on your whole family. If he was a friend, you would have to permanently disassociate yourself from that person, never mention their name again, and from their family, because it's shameful. It's a different concept of shame than we have, isn't it? It's much more permanent. It's much more, shall we say, socially deadly. Well, a person on a cross died of asphyxiation. Finally, their muscles just got too tired. They couldn't move up and down, and their chest cavity would start to slow down, and the blood pumping serums would separate, and eventually they would suffocate. That's how you died on the cross. A person could last up there. One recorded incident, a person lasted as long as 6 days on the cross. Typically, they lasted 2 to 3. Ben Hagkal, however, had a merciful thing done to him, because when they were examining the bones of his body, they also found that one of his shin bones was shattered. And this was a way, which is also in the Bible, to the 2 thieves on either side of Jesus, the same thing happened. If they wanted you to die quickly, then the Romans would come over, and with a large object of some sort of hammer or something, they would break your legs, break your knees, or in Ben Hagkal's place, break his shins. And that means you couldn't push yourself up anymore, and you suffocated within minutes. So that was considered merciful. When you think about it, you go, I don't want any of this to happen to me. So true. But that's what happened to him. And his family apparently was wealthy enough to have a private tomb. to take him down, to bribe somebody so that they could take him down from the cross. They couldn't get his foot out, so they actually had to do what I already explained to get that out. And then they took his body, they wrapped it up, they put him in a tomb. A year later, his bones are dried out. They bring him out of the tomb. They put him in an ossuary, carve his name on it with 2 other family members, and then reinstall it in some tomb. It gets covered up, and it's hidden for 2,000 years until a construction crew finds it. That's crucifixion. Now, you're a peasant. Maybe one of Jesus' disciples, you're doing something away from the city. And you're heading into Jerusalem from the west, heading towards the east. And you're approaching something that's known as the Judgment Gate. You got to go through this gate. And as you're going through the gate, you notice off to your left a large cliff-like structure that was part of a quarry. Quarry was abandoned because the rock wasn't any good. They used all the good rock. Now you see it's all honeycombed with tombs. Lots of entrances, rocks rolled over the tombs, maybe a few bushes growing up out of the rocks, and here's this big rocky face with all the tombs in it. The wind is blowing off the desert that day. As you're approaching the Judgment Gate, which you can see on the other side of the Judgment Gate, you can see the temple sticking up off the Temple Mount, the city, part of the city between the Temple Mount and you, and the gate right there as you're going in. As you approach the gate, you begin to smell roadkill. Smells like death. You see birds circling overhead near the gate, and you think, oh no, the Romans have done it again. So you know that there's a crucifixion site on the left, so you go to the right. And as you're hugging the road to the right, the wall to your right extends out from the city. So you really don't have a way to go any further than that. Besides, there might be buildings there anyway, but in this case, there's a wall there. So you start hugging the wall. And you don't really want to look upon all of this because there are nude people in torturous pain, and that's shameful. It's even shameful to look upon them, so you don't want to look. You hear dogs barking. As you approach, now the air is filled not only with the smell of death, but the smell of urine and feces. And an iron-like smell, like rust. And as you pass by, you hear people weeping and screaming off to your right as they're just kind of kneeling down watching this person who is obviously a family member of these folks. And you pass by as quickly as you can. And you get into the city. And you try not to even read what they did, but you can't really resist. What did they do to get there? And you read it's in 3 different languages up there, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. That's what they did. Oh, I got to get out of here. And in you go. Shame. 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 That's not even Jesus. That's Yohanan ben Hakka. On that happy note, let's take a break. Get some tea, refresh yourself. I am not going to get gory again. And that's not gory. If I were to really give you the details, you would not like it at all. And I think many of you probably heard anyway, or at least you can imagine. So take a break, 10 minutes, come on back, and I'm going to show you